In diplomacy, words can fail, interests clash, and yet a flower blooms. In Singapore, this flower is more than just a gesture. Orchid diplomacy, the practice of naming rare hybrids after foreign dignitaries, reveals how a small state has cultivated soft power to soothe tensions and shape relationships. But can a flower still make peace in today's harder world? Orchids have long held a special place in Singapore's national identity. Since the 1920s, the Singapore Botanic Gardens has played a pioneering role in orchid cultivation and hybridization. In fact, we chose the Vandermeer's Joachim as our national flower in 1981, a reflection of our values of resilience, vibrancy, and diversity. In 2015, to mark our 50th year of independence, we introduced the Singapore Golden Jubilee Orchid, symbolizing how far we've come as a nation. Now, the practice of naming orchid hybrids after visiting dignitaries began in 1956 with the Aranthera Ann Black, named after the wife of the then British Governor of Singapore. Since then, this tradition has flourished into a meaningful aspect of our diplomacy. More than 280 hybrids have been named in honor of visiting heads of state, government leaders, and esteemed guests. Some orchids have also been specially cultivated to commemorate key national milestones, many of which we can see in the VIP Orchid Garden. To understand orchid diplomacy, we must look at two key ideas. First, soft power. Joseph Nye's idea of power through attraction, not coercion. For small states, it's a way to punch above their weight. Second, symbolic power. Pierre Bourdieu's concept that symbols can reproduce dominance or legitimacy in subtle ways. In Southeast Asia and the Middle East, where status, face, and gesture matter deeply, Singapore deploys orchid diplomacy to signal respect, build trust, and create diplomatic space, all without appearing confrontational or weak. This aligns with Singapore's broader foreign policy principles of non-alignment, hedging, and network building. In June 2017, the Gulf region was plunged into crisis. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt abruptly cut diplomatic and economic ties with Qatar, accusing it of sponsoring terrorism and growing too close to Iran. This left many smaller countries, especially trade-dependent ones, scrambling to navigate the fallout without being collateral. Singapore, with its strong economic ties to both the UAE and Qatar, faced a diplomatic balancing act. It could not afford to alienate either side, particularly given its energy dependencies and economic interest in the Gulf. Rather than making an overt declaration, Singapore turned to a more subtle, symbolic act. Just a few months later, the Singapore Botanic Gardens named a rare orchid hybrid after Her Highness Sheikh Moza bin Nasser, a prominent Qatari royal and education reformer. To most, this might appear like a harmless ceremony, but in diplomatic signaling, this gesture mattered. It marked Qatar's continued relevance to Singapore's external relations, a quiet reassurance amidst its regional isolation. So the naming achieved several goals. Firstly, non-verbal alignment. Without officially taking sides, Singapore projected warmth and legitimacy towards Qatar. Second, elite signaling. Sheikh Moza was not just a royal figure, she was deeply involved in soft power initiatives like education and development. Naming an orchid after her aligns with Singapore's own developmental identity. And lastly, quiet hedging. While the UAE and Saudi Arabia expected partners to fall in line, Singapore used symbolic diplomacy to preserve ties with all parties, deflecting binary alignments. This case highlights how orchid diplomacy functions within a broader hedging strategy. Scholars like Kwek Cheng Wee define hedging as pursuing contradictory policy choices to avoid risk and overdependence. Orchid diplomacy offers a non-contradictory hedge. It doesn't say much, but it signals a lot. In essence, When speaking risk offense, Singapore lets this flower speak. The cases of Qatar clearly illustrate that Singapore's orchid diplomacy can be effective, but its success is conditional. It tends to flourish in specific environments, ones where diplomatic relationships are elite-driven, where conflict is not existential but rather reputational or legal, and where both sides are embedded within wider multilateral networks such as ASEAN or the Gulf Cooperation Council. But even as we appreciate these successes, we must ask, does orchid diplomacy still matter in 2025? The answer is a bit more complicated than a yes or no. We now live in a multipolar world, marked by volatility. Great power competition, especially between the US and China, has intensified, and with it, the emphasis on strategic leverage rather than subtlety. In such a climate, courtesy can easily be overshadowed by coercion. Simultaneously, we face the risk of populist domestic politics, in which foreign policy is no longer confined to the elite realm. Public opinion, nationalistic sentiment, and digital media cycles shape state behavior in real time. In such an environment, floral gestures may be dismissed as irrelevant or superficial. And lastly, in the age of information warfare, it complicates symbolic diplomacy. Images, rituals, no matter how thoughtfully crafted, can easily be misinterpreted, manipulated, or ignored. Symbolism is increasingly filtered through national narratives and algorithmic feeds. Where once the naming of an orchid signified warmth and respect, today it can be seen as performative or even condescending if not embedded in broader strategic action. Going back to scholars like Joseph Nye and more recently Cornelia Biola and Marcus Holm argue that soft power and digital diplomacy increasingly define the contours of modern influence. In this context, orchid diplomacy may struggle to resonate with the wider public, especially when compared to more visible forms of diplomacy, like viral public statements, Twitter diplomacy, or high-profile summits. Yet, for a small state like Singapore, symbolic diplomacy remains a crucial niche tool. According to Evelyn Goh, smaller states in Asia often pursue strategies of complex balancing and hedging, not by taking sides, but by fostering wide networks of trust and engagement. In this context, orchid diplomacy is not about naive sentimentality. It's a low-cost, high-impact instrument to open doors, reset tensions, and manage asymmetry in relationships when Singapore holds limited hard power. In fact, the ritualized nature of orchid naming ceremonies reflects what Ivan Newman calls the performance of diplomacy. It's a way to communicate recognition, honor, and intention without formal declarations. In relationships where cultural nuances matter, like Japan, ASEAN, and even the Gulf states, these gestures can create spaces for more serious engagement. So to conclude, can orchid diplomacy survive in today's world? Well, yes, but only if it evolves. It cannot remain confined to exclusive naming ceremonies. It has to be amplified by digital public diplomacy, where soft power is broadcast, not whispered. It should also integrate with Singapore's other forms of soft power, such as education, governance expertise, climate leadership, and regional peacemaking. Orchid diplomacy teaches us that power does not always require coercion or charisma. Sometimes it only takes patience, precision, and a little cultural creativity. In the words of former Foreign Minister George Yeo, our diplomacy is like a dance. We must be graceful and alert. The orchid is a delicate plant, but when carefully nurtured, it becomes a quiet force of resilience. And perhaps that is Singapore's greatest diplomatic lesson, that power does not always need to shout. Sometimes, let it bloom.